And we're back. Back in a new year, in a new month, and perhaps with an all-new you. How are those New Year's resolutions holding up so far? To new and longtime listeners alike, I hope your year is off to a good start, despite all the challenges we see facing the world today. For those who do not know, my name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, as well as the host of the Global in the Granite State podcast. Thank you for turning into the first episode of Year 7 of this podcast, which is just crazy to think about, and for being one of the almost 46,000 audience members who've tuned in over the years. Your interest and hopefully support is what keeps me coming back each month with a new and insightful episode. We cannot do any of this without the support of our global community, and I thank each of you for the role you play. A special thank you to our ongoing series sponsor, McLean Middleton, for their support, which helps make this program possible. I am honored that you continue to see the value of this work, and that you choose to align with these conversations. McLean Middleton is one of New England's premier full-service law firms with over 115 attorneys throughout offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. McLean Middleton's attorneys have been providing trusted legal services to businesses throughout the region for over 100 years. Learn more at mclean.com. Okay, here we go. Normally, with so many issues facing the world these days, and many of them not receiving the attention they deserve, I rarely find myself inviting a past speaker back for an update episode, let alone so quickly. However, with the raid that the U.S. military successfully conducted on January 3rd, ousting Nicholás Maduro from Venezuela, I wanted to bring back Henry Ziemer from the Center for Strategic and International Studies to unpack what we have seen and where things are going. After speaking with him last November and seeing many of his insights come to fruition, Henry stands out, for me, as a critical voice in understanding the issues at hand. Although, despite Henry's predictions on the U.S. attacking Venezuela sooner rather than later, and Peruvian shamans seeing a future where Maduro was ousted from power, and some unknown person putting big crypto bets on this outcome and winning big, it seems Henry was just as shocked as the rest of us.
I quite literally woke up to my phone ringing, and I was still on holiday mode. It's Saturday morning. I was not planning on waking up that early, I'll just say. And I pick it up, and it's two of my close friends calling me. And the first thing they say is, the U.S. just captured Maduro and his wife. I'll be honest, my first reaction was, you're pulling my leg. There's some prank you're doing. I'm about to have my goat got. And so I, of course, open up Twitter. And the first thing I see across my feed is a video of U.S. helicopters flying over Caracas. And I think, wow, that is incredible. And so I stay on the phone and I'm simultaneously reading the news, listening to what my friends are telling me, and really reacting in real time to this incredible operation. I'd say the biggest thing that stuck out was the fact that we were able to go into Caracas, into the capital of Venezuela, seize Maduro and his wife, and exfiltrate them without a single U.S. service member being killed. Of course, some were injured. One of our helicopters was damaged, but no loss of assets, and that this is probably one of, if not the most impressive special forces operations in modern history.
Certainly, this raid was months in planning, as CIA operatives moved throughout Caracas beginning in August, pinning down key details about the movements of the Maduros, and identifying the 6 to 8 places they were rotating through on different nights. There was also extensive planning and training needed to coordinate the over 150 aircraft utilized, the soldiers tasked with grabbing Maduro, and the cyber and space operations undertaken to secure the path for a successful mission. Things went so smoothly that Maduro did not have time to get to a steel-reinforced safe room in his compound, even after special forces used an explosive charge to enter the main building. Not a quiet entrance, to be sure. In under 5 minutes, operators indicated that Maduro and his wife were secured, and the teams began exfiltrating.
I think, it's accurate to say that there's probably not another armed force that could have done what we did on January 3rd with Operation Absolute Resolve, trying to defend against the United States, and especially the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, is not a fun job for anyone, let alone Venezuela.
The fight was not one-sided, of course, and it seems that the Venezuelan armed forces did respond to this incursion. The lead U.S. helicopter took fire from ground forces, and the pilot was injured in the leg. He's still recovering at the time of this recording, and Whack-N-H wishes him and the 6 or 7 other operators who were injured a speedy recovery. The Venezuelans also had an array of anti-aircraft systems in place, many of which were provided by Russia, which could have posed a serious threat to U.S. forces as they approached or left the country.
We've been treated to a lot of analyses over the past few months, lining up the Venezuelan air defenses on paper, recounting the number of different systems that they have, how they're clearly outmatched in the face of the United States, but they could definitely impose costs on the U.S. And what was revealed by this operation was that air defense systems and militaries as a whole are made up of people. They're institutions that live and die based on the quality of their people. And in the case of Venezuela, the National Bolivarian Armed Forces has spent the last several years and even decades optimizing not for protecting Venezuelan sovereignty, but for internal repression. This is a force that has become so riven with patronage and corruption and so used to their mission being internal security that they were unable to react effectively, to put up an effective resistance when the United States came in. And that's what allowed this to be the success from the U.S. perspective that it was.
Of course, in the initial aftermath of this, the world, and social media in particular, was awash with theories about how this could have happened. Did the Russians turn off systems from afar in some backdoor deal with the U.S. to sweeten their standing in the Ukraine negotiations? Were the Cubans who were tasked with Maduro's protection somehow turned against him? Did a late-night spike in pizza orders near the Pentagon tip off people that something big was happening? I'll let you manage your own rabbit hole experience if you like, but
I'll just dwell as well on another possibility, which I've seen reports coming out, which is that this was also partially an inside job, and that Delcy Rodriguez, who is now the acting president of Venezuela, was aware of this mission, that it was coming, that maybe units in the Bolivarian Armed Forces were told not to act against the United States. We don't have enough information, in my opinion, right now to say whether that's definitively the case or not. In my opinion, what we saw that night tracks more with a force that was caught off guard and by surprise than a deliberate force that stood down in the face of U.S. military force.
Layered on top of all this, it seems the U.S. has confirmed that they initiated a multi-platform attack that included successful efforts to knock out the power in the area of operations, adding to the cover of darkness that these aviators excel in exploiting. Now, we do not know, at least not yet, how this was done. Could it have been as simple as paying off someone to flip the necessary switches in Caracas at the right time? Perhaps, but you better be sure you can trust that person to follow through. Could it have been some new technology that we aren't even aware of as the public? It is possible. However, it is likely that the Venezuela's power grid was attacked through a cyber operation, similar to what Russia has done in Ukraine for about a decade already.
That was a great little detail from Trump's Mar-a-Lago press conference, that it was dark, not just because it was night, but because we turned the lights off with a certain capability that we have. I don't think he has any reason to lie. I think that this is a reflection of how armed conflict is fought. It's not just in the physical domain, it's increasingly in the cyber domain, the space and information ops domain. And so I don't doubt that the United States had the ability to get into Venezuelan networks and turn off the lights to help aid their ingress. I also think that absolutely the U.S. was probably using electronic warfare.
That electronics warfare, combined with targeted strikes on critical communications infrastructure, played a pivotal role in this operation.
We know that there were electronic attack aircraft in the sky that was having probably a big effect on Venezuela's ability to not only lock on or get their air defenses online, but also probably to communicate. So one of the first targets we saw get taken out was a communications array in the south of Caracas. And that probably had a big effect as well in terms of the Venezuelan armed forces' ability to even understand what was happening, where the US was, and coordinate a response. That is an important aspect always to, take into account when we look at modern war, and another reason for the success of this operation.
Another interesting point in all of this is what was left behind. The entire operation, despite its inherent danger and complexity, took 2.5 hours, with only 30 minutes spent on the ground. While it appears that there were some diversionary attacks initiated in other parts of the country, it seems the collateral damage was limited to key nodes in military infrastructure and the main target area.
One takeaway from looking at this operation, and as we've been doing some of the after action assessments, is how surgical this was. This was not shock and awe. This was not what the Venezuelans were expecting, which was a massive U.S. military campaign that would wipe out their armed forces, take down even all their air defense. We left sizable chunks of Venezuelan air defense intact. We left their fighters intact on the ground. It was highly surgical, highly precise. The damage that was inflicted on Caracas was limited for an operation of this scale. And to me, that suggests that the focus, we were being very clear, the focus was on Maduro.
So, this leads to a major question, which remains unresolved. I'll tell you right now, I do not have the answer for you at this point. That question is, was this an act of war? Now, of course, this is being hotly debated from all perspectives and viewpoints, with people coming to two conclusions. Mainly, anyway. Either this was a targeted law enforcement operation supported by the military, or it was an act of war against a sovereign nation. You will have to decide for yourselves until perhaps the courts decide it during the Maduro trials. Two things that stick out for me in this discussion. First, the end result, where Maduro and his wife were taken and no American fatalities occurred, allows us to have this debate. If either of those two things didn't happen the way they did, then we would be having a very different conversation today. Also, the fact that Venezuela has not declared war against the U.S., nor have they attacked any U.S. assets in response, seems to point to an end to current hostilities. However, the U.S. continues to bring up the potential for future armed actions, which could escalate into full-scale war. It is as if someone came up to you and punched you, but that was the end of it. Was it really a fight? Does it matter what we call it? Maybe not. I'll leave that decision to people much smarter than me. So, while the actions of the United States could have triggered a war, it seems that no state of war currently exists. This seems odd, but perhaps the calibrated outcome that was hoped for.
As a matter of fact, right now, obviously there's ongoing debates over whether that it was an act of war, whether we are at war, whether the president entered us into a conflict without the approval of Congress. Those are absolutely vital conversations to be having. But practically speaking, we're not in a state of conflict with Venezuela. We were in and out before the details really became known. That, again, goes to some of the surgical nature of this operation, that we really weren't trying to fight the Venezuelan armed forces. We weren't trying to take out their military. We weren't even, it seems, going after the number 3, 4, 5 in Chavismo. We were there for Maduro and his wife, and as the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State Rubio have said it consistently afterwards, we were acting to serve a warrant. Whether you believe that the Southern District of New York has enforcement power in Caracas, whether you believe that that's the southern tip of that district's reach, that's definitely up to debate. But the messaging from the United States seems to be far more restrained, I think, than people were expecting.
So, the United States is putting Nicholás Maduro on trial, and there is a lot left to be written in that space. Many people are trying to tie this to past U.S. actions, particularly as they relate to Latin America, in order to argue their case one way or another. While there is no perfect parallel, there are some important things to note.
This gets to an observation I've had about the U.S.'s role in Latin America historically, which is serving as almost the court of last resort. President Juan Orlando Hernandez was extradited to the United States to face charges of arms trafficking and drug trafficking, similar charges that Nicolás Maduro is facing himself. He was extradited, I think, in no small part because there wasn't a guarantee that the Honduran justice system could try him fairly. And in countries that face major corruption challenges or even just major criminal challenges, we've seen Mexico extradite senior cartel bosses like El Chapo Guzman to the United States. We saw Colombia extradite Pablo Escobar to the United States. The United States has always kind of fulfilled this role. What's different, of course, in this case is that this is the United States not accepting receipt of a criminal on behalf of another government, but actually going in and taking that leader himself.
This brings up another challenge in understanding what happened and where this all leads. Was Maduro the rightful head of state for Venezuela, giving him broad immunity from prosecution? Or was he a legal usurper of the presidency and instead a criminal gang leader? Depending on how you want to view U.S.'s actions, you can make an argument for either conclusion. However, as Henry mentioned last time we spoke, the accusations of heading criminal organizations was not very strong to begin with. However, what everyone can seem to agree on is that Maduro was not a good person.
The other line that the United States has said is that Nicolás Maduro is acting as a president, but he is not a legitimate president, right? In 2024, Venezuela voted overwhelmingly against Maduro, and he decided to remain in power. And that the real legitimate president of that country is Edmundo González and Maria Corina Machado, who have both asked for the United States and the international community's help in restoring democracy to Venezuela. So there's maybe some argument to be made there that we're also helping to act upon the will of the Venezuelan people, or that Maduro himself, he's fulfilling the duties of a president, but he is not actually a president himself. He's really more of a criminal thug. I'm sympathetic to those, of course. Whether or not that really holds up in the eyes of either, international or U.S. law, that's for the lawyers to debate.
It does seem telling that the U.S. government has not moved to dismantle the entire Maduro regime, which would also be illegitimate if he was not actually president. However, it may be that this is more of a pragmatic approach than a principled one. The U.S. saw the impact of the de-Baathification of Iraq, kicking everyone out of the armed forces and government, creating a disgruntled group that instigated an insurgency. A similar outcome could occur in Venezuela if a similar path was followed. Regardless, the fact of the matter is that the regime remains in place, with continued incentives to run the government the same way they always have. Entrenched interests will not give up their positions of power and sources of income, both legitimate and illegitimate, easily. Even with the threats of follow-on strikes and fates worse than what Maduro has endured, this will not be an easy situation for Venezuela's new leader to manage. So, what do we know about interim President Delcy Rodriguez?
That's the billion-dollar question, maybe, is who is Delcy Rodriguez and how will the U.S. relationship with Venezuela evolve? A lot of unanswered questions there. The first thing I'd say is I do think the U.S. has a lot of leverage over her. President Trump, in his remarks at Mar-a-Lago, even said that there is a second wave planned if things don't go the way we want to in Venezuela, and then later told The Atlantic that she would suffer a fate worse than Maduro if she doesn't listen to what the White House is telling her. Those threats probably come with a lot more heft now than they did before January 3rd, because if I'm the Venezuelan leadership, if I'm the Chavista inner circle, I just saw that the United States was able to reach out and touch Nicolás Maduro and seize him with barely a scratch on them. And I probably have no doubt that just the way that they knew where Maduro slept, what he ate, what his pattern of life looked like, where he was at all times, I have little doubt that the United States probably has that same intelligence on me. And so if I'm Delcy Rodriguez or if I'm Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, I'm thinking about that. And I'm thinking about whether or not, I can even survive another confrontation, another showdown with the United States. So I do think the U.S. has a lot more leverage. I also think that Delcy Rodriguez is the daughter of a Marxist guerrilla. She has been described by Maduro as a tiger. She obviously made her way up through the rungs of Maduro's hierarchy by being elbow deep in all the corruption and unsavory business that Maduro himself was in. That being said, in a regime like this, in authoritarian regimes like this, fundamentally the people who have stuck around are survivors. And they're caring not necessarily about ideological purity or keeping the Bolivarian revolution chugging forward. They're caring about survival. And so I do think that Delcy Rodriguez is probably willing to play ball, but the question is, what are the demands that the United States is going to make of her? Are we going to ask for something that she can't deliver? or doesn't feel comfortable delivering while still managing the various other power centers in Venezuela, that she'd be able to survive an internal palace coup herself. So that's where I see the real sources of friction and maybe miscalculation in the future.
This was one of my initial reactions to the change in leadership. I do not envy Ms. Rodriguez's position, stuck between the United States wanting concessions from her and the entrenched forces in Venezuela who will not want to give up their prime positions. It seems like an impossibly thin tightrope to walk, and one that may not be tenable for very long. One of these demands that the U.S. appears to be making, which would ruffle feathers inside of Venezuela, is that we are either going to run the government or at least tell them how to run their government. How this will exactly play out is very unclear at this point, but a stable government that complies with U.S. dictates seems to be non-negotiable for the Trump administration right now.
It does seem apparent that a driving factor in the U.S. grand strategy for this operation was stability. That's the reason why Delcy Rodriguez is in power and Edmundo Gonzalez, Maria Corina Machado, the opposition, is not. The reporting that's come out seems to suggest that the U.S. ran the simulations, they looked at the details, and they decided that it was better to basically leave the Chavista inner circle intact in the hopes that that could provide stability rather than roll the dice on the Democratic opposition and potentially facing internal splits, coups, other types of unrest. The first weeks after an event like this, a major leadership change and shakeup, are always incredibly fraught. We saw on Monday evening, actually, the Venezuelan Presidential Guard shooting at one of their own drones because tensions are running hot. They didn't know what it was. They worried that there was another attack of some sort. And so that just goes to show you how really taut the situation is, how tense everything in Venezuela is right now, and how all the power centers are still trying to figure out whether they'll be able to click together. My answer of whether we'll be able to pull this off is I don't know. I do think that the United States very clearly is trying to make sure that we do get stability. That's been a lot of the messaging initially. That's been Rubio's messaging, is that we're going to need to first stabilize the situation, and then we can talk about getting the economy back on track, and then potentially a political transition further down the road. But again, these next couple days and weeks are where the situation is going to be really volatile. And the prospect of additional U.S. military action can add further volatility to that whole mixture.
Within this volatility, it would seem that the United States undertook this action with some expectations and goals in mind. Understanding these will help us to unpack where the potential friction points may come from and balance the competing interests.
So I'd say there's three core goals that the United States is pursuing in Venezuela, three changes maybe. One has to do with oil. Trump loves oil. That was a key message in his press conference. In classic U.S. fashion, Trump says we need all the oil infrastructure. Rubio went on NBC the next day and said we don't need Venezuela's oil. So there's still a little bit of an internal debate raging, I think. But what we're seeing right now is basically we're trying to ensure that there's stability. Then the United States wants some sort of deal, basically where the U.S. gets to sell Venezuelan oil on the open market, take those proceeds, and have some control basically over how that money is reinvested into Venezuela. So there's oil. That probably advantages the U.S. Gulf Coast refineries, which are optimized for the kind of sour, heavy crude that Venezuela exports, probably benefits certain U.S. companies most in the short term.
I will point out that some of the companies in the U.S. who will be negatively impacted by this new oil coming online, if that does happen, would be the frackers in the United States. Right now, that industry needs prices of $60 to $70 a barrel just to break even, with that number rising to $95 a barrel by 2035. With prices currently hovering around $65 a barrel, there's not a lot of wiggle room left. Now, there is also a lot that has to go right to repair and improve Venezuelan oil infrastructure in order to increase production back to previous levels. This will cost billions of dollars, take years, and require huge security efforts, as guerrilla groups and perhaps even the armed forces of Venezuela could look to disrupt these efforts. Okay, so oil is one. What about the other two goals?
The second thing is drugs. This is where I can see the first level of tension emerging with the new Venezuelan government. Like the messaging about the capture of Maduro was primarily about his role as a drug lord and criminal, I think the U.S. probably wants the Venezuelan government to step up its efforts to interdict and combat narco trafficking. Potentially, that could include giving the U.S. permission to what Trump has said before, and I talked when I was last on the podcast, go after traffickers on land. So, the initial strike, we didn't target what some people thought we would have, drug trafficking and embarkation points. But maybe in the future, the U.S. will ask the Rodriguez government for permission to do airstrikes against known narco trafficking or criminal encampments. That could be a big red line for the Venezuelan armed forces, letting U.S. planes into Venezuelan airspace. But I think that's another key goal that we're pursuing. And then the final goal is U.S. adversaries. We want Venezuela to cut off its relationships with Cuba, with China, with Russia, with Iran. That's something that has been very clear and messaged from this strike and from sort of the communications afterwards. We want Venezuela to stop selling its oil to China. We want to enforce the tanker blockade that has implications for Russia and Iran. And we, in particular, want Venezuela to decouple itself from Cuba, because I think that there are forces within the White House that see Havana as the next domino to fall in the sort of authoritarian chessboard of the Americas. That's an area where I actually do think, maybe contrary to popular expectations, there's a bit of room for maneuver on the part of Venezuela. I was just saying how the remaining Chavista inner circle is survivors. I can see them using basically the same rhetoric about reclaiming Venezuelan sovereignty, kicking out foreign influence. I can see them deploying that with no sense of hypocrisy when it comes to kicking the Russians out or kicking the Chinese out or kicking the Iranians out, and then simultaneously welcoming any U.S. companies that want to in under the grounds of, oh, this is good for our economic development and this is good for our continued Bolivarian social project. So I do see a bit more daylight. And I do think it's probably bad for Moscow, Beijing, and Havana that this operation was such a success. That's an area where the U.S. probably had some pretty big equities.
Now, one thing that has resurfaced after we recorded this discussion was Fiona Hill's testimony in 2019 about Russia's attempts to trade influence in Venezuela for the U.S. backing off in Ukraine. This was not an official offer, and the U.S. at the time rejected the overtures. This was also before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. However, Russia did have forces inside Ukraine at this point in time. Is there some sort of backdoor deal on this now? We don't know, and I've not seen any reporting confirming that this is currently the case. So, if Russia did not intentionally abandon its proxy state, what does this mean for the limitations on authoritarian relationships?
The biggest signal that this sends is, again, that Russia is a fair weather friend. China is also a fair weather friend. They didn't stand up for Assad in Syria. They didn't stand up for Iran when the U.S. did Operation Midnight Hammer. They're certainly not standing up for Venezuela in any way that matters after this operation. And so I think if you consider yourself part of the global axis of autocracies right now, you're getting a sense that this is a pretty hollow alliance. You don't really get much from Moscow, certainly when the going gets tough. The big question mark, in my opinion, is Cuba. Now, we know that 32 Cubans were part of the elite unit that was protecting Nicholás Maduro, that were killed by U.S. Special Operations Forces. Analysts and members of the U.S. government have said that Havana is standing shoulder to shoulder with Venezuela. That is true. Cuban intelligence forces have been absolutely instrumental in coup-proofing Venezuela. And so I do think that whether Cuba is able to retain its hold on the Venezuelan armed forces, on the Venezuelan government, whether that relationship persists, or whether the remaining Venezuelan inner circle says, this is not worth it, it's not worth the United States coming down on us again, and actually kicks the Cubans out, I think that's going to be absolutely critical, because really the only other autocratic government that has actually offered much in the way of support to Venezuela has been Cuba.
Another interesting potential lesson from all of this is that the authoritarian regimes may need to pay more attention to outside military aggression, at least at the same level that they work to prevent internal coups. That does not necessarily mean building up new military capabilities, but perhaps working harder to ensure outside forces don't want to oust you. There's certainly no shortage of dictators who took power illegally that might be cutting deals with more powerful nations these days. Similarly, nothing in international relations are as cut and dry to say that they are good or bad for any one side. Each action has its pros and cons, and the reactions it will provoke will certainly depend on how leaders read the tea leaves. So, do China and Russia quietly welcome this action by the United States, as it signals a new age where might makes right and they can have their way in the world without the United States marshaling other countries to admonish or punish them?
Certainly, it seems rhetorically like we're entering a more realist, in the IR sense, world where people have been quoting, certainly to me a lot, the Melian dialogue from Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. The losers in this situation, if that is really what kind of world we're entering, the losers in this situation are smaller and middle powers. In particular, in Latin America, there are vanishingly few countries that could have resisted this kind of operation. Venezuela certainly was the first target, but might not be the last for this kind of style of full-scale, very well thought out elite special operations maneuver. That's one thing. The thing that I would say is maybe overblown, however, is the speculation from some analysts that we're headed toward the spheres of influence world, that the United States is going to carve up the world between itself, Russia, and China, where the Western Hemisphere ends up being the United States playground. It gives Eastern Europe to Russia and then the Indo-Pacific to China. I don't think that's true. Really, what the United States has never consented itself to simply be the master of just half the world. For an example, just about a week and some change before the capture of Nicholás Maduro, we launched Tomahawks into Nigeria. It similarly seems a little absurd to suggest that we would allow Iran to be managed by Russia and China without us having some say-so. In the Indo-Pacific, the national security strategy still makes very clear that we view the open trade through the Indo-Pacific as a central goal of U.S. foreign policy. So if anything, we're moving to a world where the United States basically says superpowers get to be hypocrites. And yes, we want to keep you out of the Western Hemisphere, but also we're perfectly fine going into your hemisphere if we sense that our national security objectives are at stake. I'm skeptical of the idea that we'll reach some sort of equilibrium. I actually think that rather the real risk is we're headed towards a world where there's a lot more centers of friction between the great powers and a lot more areas for miscalculation.
And with miscalculation comes an increased risk of war. While it seems hard to believe that China would have been deterred from military action in Taiwan if not for this raid, or that Russia now feels more justified in its invasion of Ukraine, I do see each country as taking the signal that the U.S. may be less willing to stand in the way. However, if the U.S. does remain committed to preventing these conflicts, the risk for a spiral has now increased. Beyond these two countries, this action has a much more immediate impact on Latin America. For decades, scholars, analysts, and leaders of countries to our south have been asking for a more involved United States, with many feeling that we have neglected the region for far too long. As with everything, some people will be happy with this new approach, while others will not welcome it, depending on their beliefs, interests, and perspectives.
There are a lot of governments that are going to welcome a more forward-leaning U.S. security posture. Ecuador, in particular, has been really open to and welcoming of U.S. assistance combating its criminal gangs. Argentina, the support that the U.S. gave to the Malayan government is a sign of a more positive version of U.S. engagement, actually putting its money where its mouth is and supporting a like-minded government. You may have your disagreements with Malay's style or maybe the financial soundness of it, but I think as a Latin Americanist, I was saying this is exactly what we've been arguing for the U.S. to do in the region with its allies for years. The final point I'll say is that the national security strategy that came out at the end of last year is, as written, if you look past some of the bluster, a remarkably good and allies-based Western Hemisphere strategy. It talks about enlisting and expanding partnerships. We're going to enlist like-minded countries to help us fight against drug trafficking, against instability, and we're going to expand partnerships to new countries to help them also push back against malign foreign influence like China. I think there's a version of that. And certainly what we've been trying to do is to push for that version that is a little bit more cooperatively oriented, still forward leaning, still definitely pushing for US interests in the Western Hemisphere, but more willing to cooperate, more willing to engage in dialogue. It's always, politics is sort of a game of often choosing between the lesser of two evils. I think that's definitely going to continue to be the case.
It would also seem that the policies do not need to waffle between extreme neglect and extreme intervention. There can be a happy medium to these things, and cooperation should be at the heart of it. Threats to allies and friends in the region are not going to help bring about a safer, more secure, and more prosperous region.
We need to be much better about how we deal with Mexico and Colombia. These are two allies and close trading partners of the United States that are facing profound security challenges. We shouldn't be talking about unilaterally striking them. We should instead be thinking about how we can both come to terms with the reality of the security situation in there and how the United States can share some of its expertise that was just on display on January 3rd, share some of its expertise to actually take the fight to the criminal organizations that are causing immense suffering and destruction in the hemisphere. I always try and be positive. Maybe that's overly optimistic given the circumstances, but I do want to end this podcast on an optimistic note.
The recent actions of the United States, at the very least, signal a new approach to the Western Hemisphere. While things appear calm for now, further interventions have not been ruled out, and it seems the U.S. administration feels empowered by the success of this operation. Does that indicate a new phase of U.S. military interventions? Is it simply bluster designed to coerce leaders into submission to the will of the United States? Only time will tell, and the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire stands ready to help you unpack it all. Thanks for listening to this month's episode. This has been The Global Integrated State, a program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Your interest in our work continues to amaze and inspire. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to stay up to date on new episodes, join our mailing list to learn about other programs, and donate to ensure we have the resources necessary to power this critical work. As always, Tim Horgan is the alpha and omega to this program, taking on all roles necessary to make it happen. Our theme music remains Admin by A.A. Alto, and our interlude music is Future Designed by Penguin Music. Thanks again for your interest, and we hope to have you join us next month.